Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on.
Hey gang, happy Thanksgiving. If you're in the States, I hope you have a wonderful day with your friends and family. If you're in Canada, you already had Thanksgiving, so that's enough for you. And if you're somewhere else listening around the round world, do what you think is right. Everybody, sit back and enjoy the stories. The Walk on Thanksgiving, submitted by Harrison Henderson. Warning, dead animal involved in this story. I grew up in the southern tier of New York, a very rural community with not much going on other than the VFW, the bowling alley, a couple of bars, and the school system. There weren't any big businesses, but lots of farms, and the biggest city was about 45 minutes away. It wasn't a bad place to grow up, but it was just really in the middle of nowhere. When it came to holidays, my family would always switch with who was hosting what every year. If Christmas dinner was at our place, my uncle would host Thanksgiving, and my grandparents would host Easter. Everyone rotated the days around, and it was cool. Back then, we always got the whole family together, all the cousins. It doesn't seem like that's the case anymore, but leastway not in my family. I guess that's what happens when people get spread out. Back then, when I was in high school, I was saving to buy a truck. And in my senior year, my uncle in Massachusetts was hosting Thanksgiving. My parents, brother, and sister were all going, but I asked to stay back and work with my friend Len. Len was the only Asian guy in our area, and his parents owned a Chinese restaurant. A true great immigration story with that family. His parents moved to the States in the 70s and opened up this restaurant, and it quickly became a fixture as there was only one other restaurant in town. Len still owns it after all these years, and even his wife opened up an art supply and studio next door that's very successful. They're just wonderful people. Len and I played basketball and baseball together and were in scouts. He was my best friend growing up. When I started working at 15 in the late 80s, we both got jobs at the King Walk. I learned a ton there, and by the time we were 17, we were working alongside his parents doing all the food. You want to learn how to cook quickly? Get a gig at a Chinese joint. Everything always ready in 10 minutes. Anyway, I asked my parents to stay home that year to work. The Walk was the only place that stayed open on U.S. holidays, so people did go there despite it being Thanksgiving and Christmas or whatever. My dad said it was okay, and I knew people were going to order food, but I also knew it wouldn't be like a Friday or Saturday night with tons of customers. Len and I figured it would be a simple day. My family took off that Wednesday night after work and school, and I woke up Thanksgiving morning and made my way to the Walk around 11 to get the prep going. Len's parents and the two of us were laughing and really enjoying just being together that day. His parents were so rad. His mom didn't speak much English, but they were teaching me Mandarin, and I picked up on it pretty quickly, being so immersed in it. This has nothing to do with the story, but I am fluent, and speaking is a huge part of my job in sales. I'm overseas a lot. A few people came in during the early afternoon, but it was so slow that Len's parents decided to give us two a shot at running the place until 8 that night, on our own. To be honest, that was unheard of. They were always there. For whatever reason, that Thanksgiving, his parents decided to take off, and we jumped at the chance to be in charge. After going over and over a laundry list of stuff we had to do when there were no customers, his parents told us good luck and to call them if we needed anything. We felt so important. Being the good kids we were, we dutifully cleaned and did inventory, listening to the radio and talking while taking the occasional orders as they came in. It was a fun afternoon, lots of laughing and planning stuff to do with our girlfriends later that long weekend. Dinner time was a little busier, but everything came to a crawl around 7. There were barely any cars going by outside, and when I stepped out into the sidewalk for a breath of cold air, A dense fog had settled around the few buildings on the street where the restaurant was. I was out there maybe 5 minutes, and I didn't see a single person or a car. I went back inside, and we started the final cleanup and made sure things were going to be ready for the next day. When we heard the door open, the little bell over it chimed. Len went to the counter to talk to the customer, and I could barely hear their conversation over the equipment in back. I waited for him to yell back an order, but none came. I finally looked up and saw this large guy standing in front of Len. Neither of them were talking, so I got curious real quick. Another minute of nothing, and I yelled over, "Hey, what's the holdup?" trying to joke a little. Len didn't move or say a word. Suddenly, I got a very bad feeling in my stomach and felt that Len was in trouble. Something inside me told me to stay in the kitchen, but something else told me to go up front. I reached down and got a chef knife, and holding it down at my side and kind of hidden under the apron I was wearing, I walked out from behind the counter and looked over at Len. His face was white, and then I looked at the guy. This dude was big. He was way over 6 feet tall, was wearing all dark clothes that were wet from the fog, and he was just staring at Len with these cold, dead eyes. Neither of them said a word, and I finally croaked out, "What's going on?" The guy slowly looked over at me and said, "Need this?" And he picked up this bag that looked like one of those old-time doctor bags, you saw in the old movies. The guy's voice was as dead as his eyes. I started to walk towards the two of them, and Len put a hand up at his side as if to tell me to stay back. But I didn't. I got to his side, looked at the bag, and saw that it was covered with wet, dark blood. The guy looked down at both of us and just said, "Dead baby." I was shitting in my pants as I looked into the bag and saw what looked like 2 mutilated cats. Len and I both took a step back, and I finally held up the knife and whispered, "You need to leave." The guy looked right into my eyes and said, "Yeah, you can keep that. Watch yourself tonight." Then he turned and walked out of the King Walk, the bell ringing once again. Len and I didn't move as we watched him cross the road into the fog, and that was it. He was gone. "Jesus, Len, call the cops," I said, and Len grabbed the phone and dialed. A car showed up less than 10 minutes later, and we didn't touch a thing. A sheriff came in and looked at the bag and then started asking us questions about the guy. What did he look like? Did he have a vehicle? What was he wearing? Then he asked Len for a garbage bag and covered the bag the guy had left on the counter and kind of scooped it up. The sheriff went back and forth on his radio for a while, and then I mentioned what the guy had said to us about watching ourselves. The sheriff was familiar with Len and his family and knew where their house was, but he asked me where I lived. Len then called his dad, who immediately ran back to the walk. He talked to the sheriff for a while and then said, "Hey, we're closing up." The sheriff left and we wrapped everything up quickly, barely talking. All 3 of us were freaked out. Len's dad suggested that I go to their house for the night, knowing that I was alone, but I told him I'd be fine, but I did accept a ride home. The 2 of them dropped me off at my house, and I called my uncles to tell my dad what had happened. He was quiet for a minute and then said that he'd feel better if I wasn't alone, and to call Len to see if I could still go over to their house. I did as I was asked, and Len said that, yeah, no problem, they'd be over to get me in 15 minutes. It was dead silent in my house. I grabbed a bag and stuffed some sweatpants in and some other things, and then sat in the kitchen. I was really uneasy, and for some reason, I grabbed a beer out of the fridge. I never drank. I was vibrating inside, back to being as nervous as I was in the walk. I looked at the clock in the kitchen and had about 10 minutes before they would get to my house. And that's when I heard a noise from the front of the house. Out on the porch, like someone had just walked up the steps and stopped. Our porch ran along the entire front of the house, and there was a huge picture window that looked out onto it from our living room. I turned off the light in the kitchen, got my dad's 30-30 out of the pantry closet, and slowly walked through the dark dining room and into the living room. We had a street light at the corner of our property, and it showed through the fog all blurry, but it gave enough light to see the large figure standing in the picture window. I immediately thought it was the guy from the walk, because it was. He was standing there just like he had an hour or so before. My stomach dropped. I knew he couldn't see me, but I knew he would if I went over to get the cordless phone that was sitting on the couch just under the window. I didn't know what to do. The guy stood motionless for another few minutes, and I was praying that Len and his dad would hurry up, hoping that their car would come and scare the guy off. I never even thought about how the guy knew that I lived there. Then the guy began tapping at the window, a slow, methodical tap. I was on the verge of rage and tears, not knowing what to do. And then something finally broke inside of me. I snapped. I ran to the front door and did what no one should ever do. I ripped it open, picked up the rifle, and shot once across the road into the field on the other side. The blast was so loud under the eaves of the porch, the guy jumped back and fell over the railing and into our bushes. I tried to yell something at him, but nothing came out. He just slowly got up and stared at me for a minute. And then he said in that creepy low voice, "Didn't need that baby?" And he turned and walked across my front yard, across the road, and went into the fields, disappearing into the fog and darkness. I ran back inside, called 911, and yelled into the phone that the guy was back. The operator had no idea what I was talking about and gave me a minute to get my shit together and for me to make sense. And then he pieced it together that I was one of the kids from the walk from earlier that night. He told me to stay inside and wait for help to get there. I did, and in a few minutes Len and his dad pulled into the driveway and came up to the house. Len got out and got to my front door, and I told him what happened, and then the sheriff came flying down the road and up to my house. I turned the porch light on, and the sheriff asked me what had happened and was looking at the front window. Where the guy had been tapping, there were smudges of blood. The only other thing that we all noticed, though, was the guy's footprints in the wet grass walking away from my house across the front lawn and ending at the road. I called my dad back and my uncles and told him what had happened, and he said he was coming home, but for me to go to Len's and wait for him there. The sheriff took all of these notes and said that he would escort us to Len's and to let him know if we saw the guy again. I asked him if he had confirmed what was in the bag, and he said it was 2 mutilated cats. I don't know why, but that freaked me out even more to know the truth and that they weren't fake. I stayed at Len's until my dad came around midnight and got me. Then we went home, but I was super freaked out and didn't sleep a wink. Neither did my dad. He saw the empty beer can on the kitchen table and gave me a look, but then allowed me to have a couple of beers with him to try and calm down. We ended up watching TV all night. The next day, it was like nothing ever happened. The sun came out. It was cold, but it was a nice day. Over the next few days, I was on high alert, and both our families were, and the sheriff called a few times to see if everything was okay. They never found out who that guy was. They had no idea where he came from, and no idea where he went. I never saw that man again. And to this day, I can't figure out what he was up to. Was he just trying to scare us? Was he planning something else, and where did he go? Like I said, we never found out. And even though it's been 30 years or more since it happened, it still unnerves me. That was the creepiest thing that has ever happened to me, and by far the scariest Thanksgiving I have ever had. Was it a bad choice on Thanksgiving? Submitted by KJ Cool. This is my story of Thanksgiving. It's kind of a mix of horror and sadness. Even though it happened 4 years ago during COVID, it lives in my brain and soul like it took place just a few days ago. I was 22 years old and living outside of Columbus, Ohio. The rest of my family had moved down to Florida a year prior, but I was already on my own and didn't feel like following them. I had a decent job, a girlfriend, and good friends that I didn't feel like giving up. That Thanksgiving, I decided to stay put instead of going to my parents' place and was going to do a Friendsgiving thing. Just a bunch of 20-somethings at my friend's apartment, even though we weren't really supposed to do that sort of thing during the pandemic. We didn't care. All of us had either had COVID or had gotten vaccinated, so it was kind of a fuck you to the people who didn't want us to gather. Comment as you like whether or not we should have done it, but we did. I'd been going through a lot of inner struggle and depression about life and where I was in it. Even though everything on the outside seemed awesome, inside I was not good. The funny thing is, no one noticed because I kept it all bottled up. On the outside, I was the fun and happy guy I'd always been. But inside, I was angry and sad. I'm just now in therapy looking back to see why I was feeling that way. My girlfriend of 2 years picked me up, and right away I could tell something was off. She had been a little distant the few weeks prior to this, and I kept chalking it up to us both working a lot and not having time to see one another, plus the pandemic shit. That didn't make it any easier. She didn't say much on the way to my friend Pete's house, so we just listened to the radio and chatted the little we did, and then focused on the party. She hadn't ever noticed my depression. No one did. In fact, she repeatedly told me that I was the reason she wasn't depressed, and that I made her so happy. We got to the place, and there were about 8 of us in total, including Pete's roommate, Bart. Our group had spent a lot of time together over the years, and we were all excited to be sharing the day, watching football, eating, and hanging out, knowing none of us had to work the next day. But still, this weirdness hung there between my girlfriend and I. She avoided me a lot at the party, no matter how many times I sat next to her or whatever. And finally, after a few hours, she went outside for a smoke with 2 of the other women there, and came back in with a somber face. She looked at me and said, "We need to talk." We went into another room, and I could tell what was coming next. I mean, you know how it is. When a breakup is finally coming, you just get that feeling in your gut. She started crying and told me that she was sorry, but things with us were coming to an end. I asked her if she had just found someone new, and she said no, which was a total lie. I was about to find that out. She just said she didn't have the same feelings anymore and wanted to take time to find herself. That it was all her and not me. You know the drill. I'd been in this situation in the past, but never handled it like a man. But this time, I didn't grovel or ask for a second chance. I just said, "Okay," and got up. She said, "Do you hate me?" And I said, "Nope." And I started to leave the room. "Don't you have anything to say to me?" she asked, and I paused before saying once again, "Nope." I went back into the living room and grabbed a beer and sat down next to Pete and his girlfriend. Everyone in the room seemed to know what had happened, and a couple of the girls got up and went to be with my now ex. The guys did their best to cheer me up, and then it slipped. "Chicks are crazy," said Pete. "Who the fuck knows what they want?" Bart was drunk, and before he knew it, he said, "I know what Callie wants." Callie was my ex, obviously. He immediately looked at me and knew he fucked up, and I knew it too. The 2 of them had hooked up. Rage filled my brain and my body. I was beyond pissed. This guy who had been acting like he was my buddy the whole time was the guy she dumped me for. I downed my beer and got up. Pete just said, "Hey man, take it easy." And despite my anger, I said, "You know what, Bart? You're a real piece of shit. fuck you and your entire family. I hope you all die in a fire. Yeah, that was a little over the top, but I was pissed beyond belief. I threw my empty beer bottle at him and went for my coat. Pete again said, "Take it easy, man," and I just grabbed another beer and stuffed it in my pocket while opening another one. "Fuck easy and fuck all y'all," I said, and went for the door. I lived about a 15-minute drive away, but figured it was going to take a lot longer than that. I didn't care. I was just going to walk home. I needed to get out and away. Then immediately my phone rang, and it was Pete telling me to come back and we could straighten everything out. I loved Pete, and I still do. He was the best man in my wedding just 2 months ago. But I was gone at that point. Just a big ball of hate. I stopped answering the phone, and then Callie started texting. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride? I'm sorry, I still love you, blah, blah, blah." I ignored her and just started walking in the darkness back to my apartment. I was wishing hell on her now. 15 minutes ago, I was still her guy. 10 minutes ago, I was going to handle being dumped with class. Now I wanted her to get into a car crash on her way home. Foreshadowing there. After a little bit, the texts and calls stopped as I walked down the side of the road. There were no sidewalks out where I was. I just trudged along, drinking my beer, going over everything in my head, including all the shit dumped people think about. Callie and Bart having sex, making jokes about me, the whole pity party thing. About 10 minutes later, a car pulled alongside me with the window down. A woman's voice called out, a little slurred, "You need a lift?" I stopped and looked over at a woman about my age. Her makeup was smeared like she'd been crying, and I leaned over into the open window. "Yeah," I said, throwing all caution to the wind. Fuck it, I thought. Maybe the two of us would bang somewhere and I could let Callie know that's how much she meant to me, just having sex with some random stranger. Yeah, the nonsense we think when we're angry and drunk. I got in and she started driving. Right off, I could tell she was way drunker than me, and for a second I thought maybe I should get out. But for some reason I stayed put. She said, "I'm Jessica, what's your name?" And I told her, and she drove on down the road. She asked me how my Thanksgiving was, and I told her the whole story. She was quiet and then said, "People fucking suck." Then she pulled a bottle of vodka from her lap and took a big swig. "They all suck," she said again. I asked her what happened to make her cry, and she said that her fiancé had left her. No discussion, no nothing. Just a note on their bed, and all his stuff was gone from their place when she came home from work. That was it. Poof, he'd left. We commiserated for a while, and then I remembered I hadn't told her where I lived. "You got any booze there?" she asked, and I said yes. I asked her to come over, and she said, "Sure, why not?" But it wasn't a good response. It was like a lifeless response. I remembered my other beer and opened it and drank it down. But then, in the silence, I felt something terrible. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I suddenly felt like I was in danger. Jessica was silent. Her eyes were on the road, but they seemed to be someplace else. I looked up at an overpass we were heading towards, and she just said, "People fucking suck," enunciating each word like there was a period at the end of them. Then she stepped on the gas, and I rocked back in my seat. In the next second, she screamed, "People fucking suck!" And I realized she was headed for the pillar in the middle of the overpass. Time seemed to slow down. Later, I was told we hit the overpass at 65 miles an hour, and everything felt like a dream to me. I remember being thrown back and then thrown forward. I remember hearing the crunch of the car and shattering of glass and then weightlessness. Then seeing a concrete wall coming at me really fast, and me smashing into it. I had been thrown clear through the windshield and into the overpass. I remember hearing a crunching sound, and then everything went black. I woke up and didn't know where I was. but I was wet and could smell gas. Everything was swimming around me, and I just lay there looking up at the bottom of the overpass, my mind slowly coming back to me. There were sounds of blaring horns and people yelling, but it was like that was all happening on another planet. It wasn't happening where I was. Suddenly, there were people over me, and more yelling, and these voices saying, "Are you okay? Can you hear me? Don't move, don't move." I, for some reason, thought I should get up and rolled onto my side, but a terrible pain burned up my arm, and I stopped, and I yelled out. There were more voices of "Don't move!" screaming at me, but it was like I was underwater. After what seemed like forever, another voice was in my face saying, "Hold on, son, hold on." I opened my eyes and looked up to see a cop kneeling over me, and then he was yelling into his shoulder. Then back at me, "Don't move, kid. Just stay where you are." Then everything went dark again. I woke up later in a brightly lit hospital room, hooked up to an IV, some heart monitor stuff, all kinds of wires. My left forearm was wrapped in a huge pile of bandages, and when I tried to pick it up, it hurt like hell. I was all alone, but then a nurse came in and said, "Take it easy. You're okay." Everything came flooding back to me, and I started crying. Yeah, a 22-year-old guy crying his eyes out. Over the next few hours, the cops came in and out, asking me everything that I remembered, to my best ability. I told them about Jessica. I told them about getting dumped and getting a ride from her. I told them what she had done, and then they filled me in on the rest. Jessica had obviously driven into the overpass. She was killed instantly, and me, not wearing a seatbelt, had gone through the windshield. They asked me if I knew her, and I told them that I had never seen her before. I didn't know one lick about her, just that she was sad and mad at the world, just like I was feeling. I suddenly felt terrible, like I was the reason she did what she did. I'll cut to the end of this, my most messed up Thanksgiving. My dad flew home the next day to get me at the hospital. I had shattered my arm from the elbow down, but amazingly, that was the worst of the damage. They had to use that plaster thing on my body to get a ton of the glass out of my skin, and it's still marked up from that today. But miraculously, I didn't suffer anything other than a concussion from when I hit the wall. My friends came as soon as they heard, and everyone was saying that they were sorry for not chasing me down and making me stay at the party. Pete still kicks himself over not doing more, but I've never held a grudge. He's still my best friend. Funnily enough, Callie tried to visit me at the hospital, but I pretended to be asleep when she came in. I heard her crying. She left. I was thankful for being alive, but I didn't want her anywhere near me. The entire thing was a wake-up call. I had been wallowing in life, just working a job and not doing much else. The crash and the realization of how short life is kicked me in the ass. There were a ton of interviews and paperwork I had to do with the police and authorities about what I remembered of the accident, but I did get a settlement from Jessica's insurance company. When I finally got out of the hospital a week later, I quit my job, got out of my lease, and moved to Tallahassee almost immediately. I went back to school for my master's, and now I'm teaching high school with a tutoring business that I own. I employ 6 other people. I recently married the love of my life, and life is good. And every Thanksgiving, I am grateful for this life. I'm even thankful that I met this crazy woman Jessica, who was not long for this earth. So every Thanksgiving, I also ask myself, was it a bad choice to get into a car with a total stranger who turns out was as depressed as me and also hammered? I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever have an answer to that. But each Thanksgiving since, I've spent the first part of the day meditating and thinking about her, where she is now, and if she's found peace. And the funny thing is, for the past 3 years, every Thanksgiving morning during that time I'm meditating, I am greeted by a cardinal on my back deck. I like to think it's Jessica visiting me. It's a reminder of that night, a reminder of the change to come in my life. I look forward to seeing her this Thanksgiving. Crazy Woman on the Road, submitted by Ellen K. Ellen is not my real name, but I hate it when stories are anonymous, so there's that. Thanks for reading this if you do. When I first left home and was out on my own after college, I had taken a job on the far end of Kansas from where my parents lived. They were in Overland Park, and I was on the other side teaching in Ulysses. Thanksgiving has always been a huge holiday for my family, so I was always stoked to see everyone that I only saw once or twice during the year on that day. My aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents were all going to be at my parents' house, and I was going to make the 6-hour drive after school to get to my folks' place around midnight. So I loaded up my Jeep with snacks and drinks and CDs and hit the road around 7. It was later than I had originally planned, but I'm a terrible packer, and it always takes me longer than I think it will. I was taking Route 50 all the way, so for your reference, it's not an interstate with rest areas. If I needed to stop, I would have to wait for the next town to pull over and do what I needed to do. I made it about 2.5 hours before nature called, so I cruised along until I came to a town with a super bay, and I pulled into the lot for a break. I stretched my legs and got gas even though I was at 3/4 of a tank. The guy in the super bay told me the restroom was out, but I could use the bathroom at a restaurant next door. I walked over and asked if I could use the bathroom, and a bartender said sure. And when I left, I noticed a woman standing near my car and thought, well, that's odd. What does she want? As I got closer to her, I noticed that she looked terrible. Faces of meth, if you will. She was shaking terribly and asked me for a cigarette, and I told her I didn't have any. I lied, I had plenty. And then she asked me where I was going. I was very weirded out by her, and she kept looking over her shoulders as she talked, and I just walked around my car to get to the driver's side. I told her that I was going home, not the actual town name, and she said, yeah, home is good. Home is good. You got a cigarette I can bum? I told her no once again and said, Happy Thanksgiving, got in my Jeep and left her there under the gas pump lights. I called my mom to tell her where I was and kept rolling through the night. I know I shouldn't have guzzled 2 Red Bulls, but my desire to stay alert overfought my desire to not have to stop for the bathroom again. And on top of that, I've always had a weak bladder. So, 2 hours later, I was squeezing my legs waiting for the next town. I passed 2 places that were closed already, but came to another quick stop, just as I thought I'd pee my pants. I ran inside and used the bathroom, and when I got out, the cashier said, Bathrooms are for paying customers, honey. I didn't think she was serious, but I didn't want to be a bitch, so I grabbed some gum and paid. As I turned to the door, I stopped. Outside of my Jeep was the woman I had seen 2 hours earlier. At first, I didn't think it was possible. How the hell could she have gotten here? Then I tried to convince myself that it wasn't the same woman. But as I went out the door and got closer to my Jeep, sure enough, it was old Methy. I turned around and went back into the store and asked the clerk if she saw the woman by my Jeep. She looked and said, yeah, she got out of a truck a minute or so after you came into the store. And the truck drove off and she's just been standing there. Okay, I said, making sure I wasn't hallucinating this woman. I cautiously walked back out to my Jeep, and the woman saw me and asked me for a cigarette just like before. Like it was the first time we had met and not the second. I told her, nope, I don't, excuse me, and I opened my door. She asked me where I was headed, and I couldn't believe it. It was a complete repeat of what had happened 2 hours earlier, almost word for word. Home is good, she said, again when I told her where I was going. I just got in as fast as I could and got back on the road. I called my mom again and told her what happened, and I could tell she had gotten into some wine because she was just laughing at me and told me that I was losing it. "Too many hours on the road after a long day at work, sweetheart," she said. She wasn't taking me seriously. But I did stay on the phone with her for a while and kept driving, convincing myself I could make the next 2 hours without having to stop. But then the worst happened. I got sick to my stomach after an hour or so. Too much junk food, snacks, and Red Bulls were going to town on my tummy. I tried everything to get my mind off of it, smoked a few cigarettes, and then finally couldn't take it. I saw a Phillips station coming up and pulled in, and thank God they were open 24/7. I made it into the bathroom and immediately felt better, and I promised myself I would drink nothing but water from there on out. I was only about an hour from home at that point. I bought a fresh bottle of water at the counter and then went out to my Jeep. But on my way out, I noticed a blue pickup truck at the far end of the lot near the road that wasn't there when I had gone into the store. I'd been inside for about 10 minutes, and hell, it could have been anyone, so I tried not to focus on it. I gassed up, got in my Jeep, and then lit a cigarette. I was just about to call my mom to let her know where I was, when there was a loud smack on my driver's side window. There, with her face about an inch from the glass, was the woman again. I didn't have anything in my system, but if I did, I know I would have peed myself. This time she screamed at me, "You lied! You lied! You do have cigarettes!" For a minute, I was frozen in shock. I saw her take something out of her purse that looked like a metal brick or something, and she swung her arm back like she was going to smash my window with it. I let out a scream, put it in drive, and sped forward before she could do anything. I almost ran into the front of the store but jammed on the brakes, and the woman was screaming, "You lied! You lied!" over and over again. And it got the attention of the cashier, who came out of the front doors with a "what the hell" on his face. He looked at me, looked at her, and then called out, "Is there a problem here?" The woman stopped screaming, and then screamed again, "She's a liar! She's not going home! She has cigarettes!" Then she turned and ran for the pickup truck and got in, and it tore away in the direction I had come from, far off down the road. The cashier turned to me and asked if I was all right. I was shaking uncontrollably. I said I would be okay, and then he asked me if there was anything that he could do. My mom called me right at that moment, and before I started talking, she could hear him talking to me, asking if I was okay. I broke down in tears and told her that I was being followed and I didn't know what to do. Then my dad got on, calmed me down, and asked me what was going on. He told me to start driving and that he'd head out and meet me on the way, about a half hour or so. Then he would follow me and make sure that I got home safe. The cashier stood with me the whole time, and I thanked him for his help. He said no sweat. He didn't do anything. He was just watching out for me. I got back on the road and stayed on the phone with my dad for another 45 minutes before we met up. We got out of our cars for a second, and he gave me a hug and said I was going to be fine, to start driving and that he'd stay right behind me. But right as we were getting back in our cars to leave, my dad stopped and looked up. A blue pickup truck was on the side of the road about 50 yards away from us. As we stood there, it slowly turned around in the road and then drove off back down the highway to the west. My dad just said, "Get in, let's go." We drove the rest of the way to my folks' house with no incident, and I collapsed on the couch as soon as we got inside. We talked about it late into the night, and finally I had to get some sleep. I was shot. The next day was a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I got to see all of my family. We had a blast. To this day, I have no idea who that woman was, or who might have been in that truck with her, or if she was driving it herself, but I'm pretty sure she was with another person. It's pretty messed up that whoever it was followed me across the entire state of Kansas. I'm convinced they were ready to harm me at the very least, and I'm thankful that I got home okay with the help of my dad. It was a wonderful Thanksgiving, but I was petrified when I had to drive back home after the holiday. It was a long drive, but thankfully, I never saw that woman or that truck again. And as our tradition, let's end on a gross but funny one. Little Ricky by Jean J. One fateful Thanksgiving 17 years ago, my hubby and I hosted our family Thanksgiving. My sons were excited to see their extended family and pitched in the week before, cleaning the house from top to bottom. My hubby did all the shopping to give me time to bake, and we were all working as a team to make it a great holiday for everyone. I was up early on Thanksgiving morning to start getting things ready, and my family was up soon after doing last-minute preparations to ensure all the kids would have a good time, and the adults would be able to relax a little as well. My sisters arrived with their families around noon to help out, and then my husband's side came shortly after, his brother and sister and their kids. It was a first in a long time for his sister, as she had moved to Alaska, and we rarely saw her or her family. She was kind of the black sheep of the family, but we still loved her. This trip would be the first time we would meet little Ricky, her youngest son. He was a goofy little guy of 5, and I immediately fell in love with him. Ricky was full of life and love and had a million questions for everyone. A little while later, my hubby ran to get his parents, and my sons got all the cousins out in the backyard playing football and tag. Everyone else was chatting away and catching up. But little Ricky kept wandering in, asking his endless questions about our house, our dogs, what we were having to eat, you name it. He was really making us laugh with his observations. We lived out in the country and have lots of animals around, and Ricky kept talking about the rabbits he was seeing. We had tons of them in the field next door, and they spent a lot of time in our yard thanks to my vegetable gardens. Those were long gone with the upcoming winter, but the rabbits were still all over the place. And this is important, believe me. So, my hubby returned with the grandparents, and Grandma, bless her soul, was told she didn't need to bring anything, but she insisted on bringing a salad. She actually brought all the stuff for it and was going to make it just before dinner. As the kids were in and out of the house, little Ricky focused his attention on Grandma and barraged her with his questions, to which she was also tickled pink. He asked to help her with her salad, and she was overjoyed at his attention. When she pulled out a bag of walnuts, he asked what they were, and she told him. "People like a little crunch in their salad, Ricky," she said. And he asked to put them in, and Grandma obliged him. Then, as if coming up with a great idea, Ricky's face lit up and said he'd be back, and then he ran outside to play with the rest of the kids. About an hour later, dinner was ready, and I called everyone in to get washed up, and Ricky came in last, holding his hands in his jacket pocket, and he dawdled as the rest of the kids got cleaned up. I went into the dining room where the adults were already sitting down and got everyone's drink orders. Then I went back into the kitchen and saw that I had forgotten Grandma's salad and brought it back out to the dining room table. The kids came running in, and everyone sat down for grace, and then the traditional passing of all the food items. Everyone got their shares as my hubby carved 2 turkeys, and soon we were all digging in. My brother-in-law was the first to notice something was up. He paused while stabbing at his salad and said, "Who made this?" Grandma said she did, and he looked kind of perplexed. "You make it today?" he said with a chuckle. She replied she had just made it, and he shook his head and moved on to something else on his plate. One by one, everyone got to their salads and had the same reaction. Finally, Grandma was sensitive and asked what was wrong with the salad. My hubby looked down at his plate, and his eyes got big. He He began pushing something around in the greens, and then a huge grin broke out over his face. He picked up something with his fork and said, "Something special for us this year, Mom?" It was a little blackish oval. It was a rabbit pellet. The table went silent, and then my hubby and his brother burst out laughing. It seems little Ricky was so high on helping Grandma get more crunchy things in the salad. He had taken it upon himself to scoop up a couple handfuls of rabbit poop and pop it into the salad, not knowing exactly what he was doing. Grandma was mortified, and my sister-in-law looked like she was going to faint from embarrassment as the rest of us laughed and laughed after making sure no one had actually eaten any of the salad. Thank God no one had. Poor little Ricky didn't realize what was going on until my son told him, "Dude, you put rabbit shit in the salad." And then we were all bursting out laughing again. Ricky looked really sad for a minute before I told him it was okay, and it was the thought that counted. The rest of the meal and day was not as big a disaster as Grandma's salad. It could have been so much worse. All these years later, we still talk about rabbit salad, and little Ricky, who just finished law school, still hasn't lived that one down. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on this channel or my podcast, email it to unclejosh.truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Happy Thanksgiving to all of you listening in the States, and especially thank you for those folks who sent in stories. I know it was a late call for that, and I didn't even think I was going to get any, but I'm very glad that you shared. I hope that you enjoy the day with your families and friends, and I hear Friendsgiving is a popular thing, and if you're doing that, I think that's awesome too. Everybody, enjoy. Follow me on social media, links to that are in the description below, and if you could take a second and you like this video, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing to the channel if you don't already, and tell a friend. Leave a comment. I'd love to know what you think of the stories, too. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. If you would like to support the channel even further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description, as well as my storefront at tpublic.com. Get yourself some Uncle Josh Campfire Crew merchandise. Everybody, on Thanksgiving, there's no better way to live than by being excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.